This is part 4 of the Delta 7-inch motor-driven bench grinder rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 3, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to be cleaning up a bunch of the parts. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. In part 3, I said I placed all the parts in simple green to soak for about 1.5 to 2 weeks. And here I'm just removing those parts, and you can see that the simple green really did a number on that orange paint. Some parts it removed it better than other parts, but a little water and a wire brush, and I was able to remove probably 90% of that paint. So the simple green also removed most of your oil and your grease from everything. And that's the reason why we use simple green. So the next thing that we're going to be doing is soaking all these parts in citric acid. And the citric acid will remove the rust. So I'm not going to show a whole lot of me scrubbing parts, but that's what everything looked like after we finished scrubbing it and rinsing it off. And from here, we're going to be mixing up the citric acid. So on average, you should be mixing about a tablespoon per gallon of water. I tend to go a little overboard, and I use like a shot glass per gallon roughly. Now, I do not recommend that you put any alloys in the citric acid. Things like aluminum or Zamak or magnesium or anything like that. You can put it in the citric acid, but you only want to let it soak for about an hour. After that, it starts to develop this weird powdery film type coating on the parts. So I only soaked them for an hour, if at all. But the steel parts and the cast iron parts, no problem at all. You can soak that stuff in citric acid for weeks on end. It'll be fine. Now, to remove the rust, I normally soak stuff just overnight. And that's how long this stuff got soaked. But this is all the nuts and bolts, everything. Everything except for the Zamak parts or the aluminum parts, which were basically the twin lights and the felt retainer or bearing seal assembly, as it's called in different owner's manuals. But you see the parts sitting here on the towel. Those are the parts that didn't get soaked. And of course, you don't want to soak any of your panels in the citric acid. Anything that has graphics on it, it should not have gone in the simple green, and it should not go inside the citric acid. So after a day, I pull everything out, I rinse it off, and then I'm going to towel dry it. And when we towel dry, all we're trying to do is just, the drier we can get the parts pretty fast, the less surface rust they'll start to build up on them. If you're going to be painting the same day, then it's not so much an issue, but for me, a lot of times stuff may sit for a couple days before I get to it again. So after I've got all those parts dried, the nuts and bolts, anything that's not going to get painted, or at least not painted right away, I'm going to coat with WD-40. And all this is going to do is prevent those parts from rusting for the time being. The WD-40 is not a long-term solution for preventing rust because it has water in it, and stuff that WD-40 is placed on will eventually rust. But for these parts, I just want to keep them from rusting for the next couple of days. Now, some of those nuts and bolts we are going to be painting though. And mostly that's going to be the nuts and bolts that are exposed on the outside of the grinder. There is some paint left on some of these parts. The original paint, which is that gray, And to remove that, I'm just using a wire cut brush on my angle grinder. I've got kind of a really tight one, and then I've got a kind of a loose one. That loose one kind of fans out more and is wider, and I can get into smaller areas with it, but I'm going to use a combination of the two, as well as some other wire brushes on a drill to get into some of these areas. For instance, you can see some of that orange paint in these bearing hubs or bearing caps where the long bolts would go. And there is, you can see yellow paint inside that rail area on these covers. And the bracket for the quench pot is really rusted in there, so we're going to get that out of there. We let it soak for about 20 to 30 minutes with that PB blaster on it, and I know for a fact that it comes out of there because I've got one. So we're just going to mess around with a couple of different methods here. We're just using a torch here and that rubber dead blow hammer, and once we start to get it moving, then we're in business. My biggest concern here at the time was I've never seen one that's threaded, but I was like, man, it's so tight in there. I was scared that it was threaded, and we were going to end up breaking the cup or cracking it. But no. Heat, PB blaster, and some elbow grease, and yep, I was able to tap the cup off of there eventually. And it'll just slide off of there here in a minute. You can see it. It's moving now. And come on. There we go. So we're going to soak that in some simple green because of all that PB blaster we slathered on it. We'll let that soak for a couple of hours, and then we'll rinse it off, and then we'll put it in citric acid. Back to the wire wheeling. This is that looser cup brush that I was talking about, and you can see how it kind of fans out more and gets narrower. But sorry, I put my head in the way there. I was trying to see inside those rails to get that paint out of there. And then for these, that orange paint that's in those recessed areas where the long screws go, I'm just using this little brush attachment that's on a drill. And trying to figure out a good angle to get it, and then I just decided I could brace it in there with my thumb, and there you go. Cleans it up really good. You can see both of those got really clean. Next, we've got a brass wire brush, and we're going to clean out the bores for the bearings with those. And then this is my Fordham or a Dremel, and I've got an abrasive, it's kind of like Scotch-Brite. It's this weird spongy stuff, but it's abrasive. It comes in a bunch of different grits. I'm just using that to get into some of those smaller areas. same thing. And then anything that's going to get painted, we're going to be wire wheeling regardless. So over at the wire wheel on my grinder, I'm cleaning up various parts. This is one of the outer covers. That's the bottom cover plate. And this is one of the inner flanges. That's the spark arrestor. And the spark arrestor is not getting painted, but I was cleaning up a bunch of parts, so may as well clean it up too. This is one of the brackets for the tool rest. And this is the other half of it. And then I just cleaned the threaded areas of the rotor with this wire brush. And we'll clean up the rest of the rotor with the metal lathe. And then this is one of the twin lights. So here's part of the brackets for the tool rest, and I'm just cleaning out the inside of it with another wire brush. This is like a bottle brush. Same for a lot of the threaded holes and bores that are in these parts. Next, we're going to go ahead and mask the stator. And it is going to get painted, so it needed to get masked anyways. But the way we're going to clean up the outside of the stator is with that wire wheel on my grinder. So I want to mask off the windings as much as possible to protect them. Now that tape is not going to do a whole lot of protection, but if I'm careful, I won't mess up the windings with that wire wheel. So here we are at the wire wheel, and first I'm just going to clean the edge, the top edge, all the way around on both sides. And then we start cleaning the outside. And as long as you're really careful when you get to the edges, it's not that big of a deal. It's heavy. It definitely is a workout after a while, but yeah, you can see how much orange paint is being kicked on my tarp behind the grinder. That whole area over there ended up turning orange. So for the inner edge of that top edge, the lip that's in there, I'm just using a small brass wire wheel on my Fordham again. And then after we've got all that cleaned up, I'm going to clean that edge with some Q-tips and some mineral spirits. And then I'm going to clean the outside with a rag and mineral spirits. And then that piece is ready to get painted. So we can just set it aside and let it hang tight until we're ready to paint. So back over at the wire wheel, these are the tool rests. I'm just doing a final cleaning on them and sanding them down to kind of true the face on them. But it's weird. It's almost like they're made out of two different metals there, but I have no idea. I didn't make them. And these are the spring clips for the twin lights, and then we've got various nuts and bolts. If it's too small for me to hold in hand, then I'll put it in a vice grip and then work it. Now, I've been told by many people that you should not be working with gloves when you're working around spinning stuff like that. But that's how I've always done it, and I've never had an issue. But I am not recommending that you wear gloves when you work with a wire wheel like that. So, these parts that I just put in this metal bin are going to get soaked in some denatured alcohol. And they're getting soaked because all these parts are going to get painted black. Denatured alcohol will evaporate real damn fast, so we're just going to cover this with some cellophane and let that sit for about an hour. After it's been an hour, we can pull each piece out of there. And I've just got a piece of 2x4 that I've drilled some holes in, put some dowels on, and that's how I'm going to hold a lot of that stuff, because the part that we're interested in painting is the part that can be seen, the head of all these nuts and bolts. And for the spring clips, I'm just going to put them in clothespins that I hang inside my paint booth. And I'm going to be spraying these down with KG metal coating. It's a firearms coating that is baked on. It's got Teflon in it. And it provides excellent saltwater protection for firearms and that kind of stuff. If you're familiar with Cerakote, it's similar to Cerakote, but you don't have to do any mixing. And I've been using it for several decades, but if you're a Sig Sauer fan, Sig used to have to send your guns back to the factory to get what they call K coating, which is a Teflon moly-based firearm coating that protects the metal, and this is the exact same stuff. So after these parts were sprayed, they're transferred to that tray that goes inside an oven, and they'll cook at 350 degrees for about an hour. After they've been sprayed, they can dry to the touch in about 30 minutes, so I can handle them and put them on that tray. So the next thing we're going to do is clean up this motor data panel. And for that, I'm using this Meguiar's cleaner wax. This is what I use on all the graphics panels that I have on various tools to clean up. So here we have the motor data panel. We have the on-off switch panel. We have the BN16 brass panel, and then we have the serial number panel. And we're just going to apply this cleaner wax to these panels and then let it sit until that stuff starts to dry, about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll come back and buff it off. Now at this point, I had not made the decision that I was going to replace this panel. I felt like I was probably going to have to, but had not made the decision to do so. I wanted to see how well it was going to clean up first. And so here we're just rubbing down the on-off switch panel. Now, if yours is really messed up, you can order a replacement one of these from that guy that I mentioned in the first video that sells stuff on eBay. PO2 Bob or something like that. He sells those. And he sells the motor data panels too. They're just not as accurate as I want for this rebuild. But the on-off switch panels look pretty good that he sells. And this one cleaned up pretty decently, except for the orange paint that's on it. Luckily, most of that orange paint is on parts of this panel where there is no printing. So removing it, I'm just using an X-Acto knife here, and I've got the blade turned, and I'm just scraping the orange paint off of there, trying not to damage any of the graphics. And here we are with the motor data panel, and we're buffing it, and you can already see it has a lot of orange paint on it. And the area in the center here where all the data is has got like a film on there that's got a yellow tint to it. I think a lot of these came with like a clear film over them, and that clear film is just completely degraded at this point. There's no way to really remove it, so I'm going to end up replacing that motor data panel. So here we are at the metal lathe, and all we're going to be doing is cleaning up the shaft of the rotor. So obviously you've got the fan, and so the fan is on the right side, and then you've got the bracket on the left side of the center part of the rotor. And if you get your fingers in there, you will lose a finger. So not a good idea. Be very, very careful. But here I'm just wet sanding this because I do not want to change the dimensions of this shaft. A bearing has to sit on it. So I'm only wet sanding, and I'm starting with 400 grit, 600, 800, and then 1000 grit. And then we're applying this Mother's mag and aluminum polish. And after we've got it all smeared on there, we're going to buff it off with one of these sham wows. And it should shine that up real nice. And then we'll just turn the rotor around inside the metal lathe and do the other side the exact same way. If you are going to wet sand, remember to rinse between each grain. Otherwise, you're just going to be fighting yourself, and you'll never get the desired results. So after we've buffed both sides, then we're going to go ahead and coat the shaft down on both sides with super slick stuff. And I like this stuff because it's an outstanding penetrating oil. But I coat both sides of it, and then I'm going to wipe it down with a paper towel after it. And that's all we're going to do with that. So this will wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. If you did, please like and subscribe. In the next video, we're going to be masking and painting, so that'll be interesting. I appreciate all the support, and as always, I will see you next time.